In the summer of 1940, as the Battle of Britain raged over southern England, ground crews at RAF Hornchurch noticed something peculiar about squadron leader Colin Falkland Gray. While other pilots strapped themselves into their Spitfires wearing standard-issue flying boots, heavy leather affairs designed for warmth at altitude and protection in case of crash, Gray climbed into his cockpit barefoot, or nearly so. Sometimes he wore socks, sometimes nothing at all. His boots sat discarded in the dispersal hut while he flew combat missions against the Luftwaffe with his bare feet working the rudder pedals. It wasn't a stunt or affectation. Gray, a New Zealander who'd joined the RAF before the war, had discovered that flying without boots gave him finer control over the rudder, critical in the split-second maneuvers that determined whether you killed the enemy or the enemy killed you. Real quick, please like and subscribe to help our channel grow. Now back to the story. The heavy flying boots, designed for safety rather than sensitivity, deadened the feel of the pedals. Without them, Gray could sense precisely how much rudder pressure he was applying, could make minute adjustments that kept his gun sight steady on target while maneuvering violently. In an aircraft where the difference between a kill and a miss could be measured in fractions of a degree, that sensitivity mattered. His squadron mates thought he was mad. His superiors worried he'd lose his feet to frostbite. Temperatures at 20,000 feet could drop well below zero, and the Spitfire's cockpit was drafty at best. But Gray kept flying barefoot, and he kept coming back with kills. By the time the Battle of Britain ended, he'd become one of the RAF's leading aces by war's end. His confirmed victories would exceed 28, making him one of New Zealand's most successful fighter pilots and one of the most effective ace pilots of the entire conflict. The barefoot flying became part of his legend, the eccentric Kiwi who fought the Luftwaffe in his socks. But the legend obscures the reality. Gray wasn't successful because he flew without boots. He was successful because he combined exceptional natural ability with studied tactical brilliance, because he understood aerial combat at a level most pilots never achieved, and because he possessed the kind of ice-cold aggression that made him deadly in circumstances where other pilots hesitated. The bare feet were just the most visible quirk of a pilot who approached combat flying as both art and science, who studied his enemies as carefully as he studied his aircraft, and who survived years of combat through a combination of skill and calculated violence that the Luftwaffe learned to fear. This is the story of Colin Gray, the barefoot pilot who became a legend, the tactician who outfought some of Germany's best, and the man who proved that sometimes the most effective warriors are those willing to ignore convention in pursuit of the smallest advantages. The farmer's son who learned to hunt. Colin Falkland Gray was born in 1914 in Christchurch, New Zealand, the son of a sheep farmer. His childhood was rural and unremarkable, helping on the farm, attending local schools, learning to ride horses and shoot. The shooting would prove relevant. Gray developed into an exceptional marksman, hunting in New Zealand's backcountry where a clean kill required patience, steady hands, and the ability to judge distance and lead moving targets. These were precisely the skills that would later make him a deadly aerial gunner. Aviation fascinated him from adolescence. In the 1930s, flying was still romantic and relatively new. Barnstorming pilots toured New Zealand, offering rides and performing aerobatics. Gray saw these displays and decided he wanted to fly. In 1938, at age 24, he traveled to Britain and applied to join the RAF. The timing was fortunate. The RAF was expanding rapidly in anticipation of war, accepting qualified volunteers from Commonwealth nations. Gray was accepted for pilot training. He proved to be a natural aviator. The RAF's training program was intensive. Classroom instruction in navigation, meteorology, and aircraft systems, followed by progressive flight training from basic trainers to operational fighters. Gray excelled throughout. His instructors noted exceptional coordination and judgment. He seemed to understand instinctively how aircraft behaved, how to make them do what he wanted with minimal wasted motion. More importantly, he demonstrated the kind of aggressive mentality that fighter pilots required. He didn't just fly the aircraft. He attacked the exercises, pushing limits, exploring the edges of what was possible. By September 1939, when Britain declared war on Germany, Gray had completed training and been assigned to 54 Squadron, equipped with Supermarine Spitfires. The Spitfire was the RAF's premier fighter. Fast, maneuverable, well-armed, a beautiful aircraft that looked as deadly as it was. Gray loved it immediately. The Spitfire responded to light control inputs, climbed like nothing else he'd flown, and gave him the platform he needed to employ the skills he'd been developing. The squadron spent the phony war period on convoy patrols and training exercises, seeing minimal combat. But Gray used the time productively. He studied the Spitfire's capabilities obsessively, learning exactly what it could and couldn't do. He practiced gunnery constantly. The squadron's senior pilots emphasized that shooting was the essential skill, that you could be the best aerobatic pilot in the world. But if you couldn't hit the target, you were useless. Gray, with his background as a marksman, understood this intuitively. He flew practice intercepts until he could judge deflection angles automatically, until the gun sight's position relative to the target became second nature. And somewhere during this period, he discovered that flying without boots gave him better rudder control. The exact moment isn't documented. Gray himself rarely discussed it in detail, treating it as a personal preference rather than something requiring explanation. But ground crews noticed, squadron mates noticed, and eventually his commanding officers noticed. Some thought it was dangerous. Others thought it was eccentric but harmless. Nobody could argue with the results once combat began. Battle of Britain. Learning to kill. The Battle of Britain began in July 1940 with German attacks on Channel convoys and coastal targets. By August, the Luftwaffe was striking at RAF airfields, attempting to destroy fighter command on the ground and in the air before launching the invasion of Britain. 54 Squadron, based at Hornchurch near London, was thrown into the battle immediately. Gray's first combat sorties were the standard experience for new pilots. Confusion, fear, the overwhelming sensation of too much happening too fast, enemy formations appeared suddenly. Aircraft diving and turning in 3 dimensions, tracer fire everywhere. The radio cluttered with shouted warnings and commands. Pilots described combat as organized chaos, trying to maintain formation while tracking enemies, keeping situational awareness while maneuvering violently, remembering procedures while instinct screamed to do something, anything, to survive. Gray survived his early combats and began learning. Each sortie taught lessons: what worked, what didn't, how German pilots behaved, where they were vulnerable. The Luftwaffe's tactics in 1940 were doctrinaire and somewhat predictable. Bomber formations flew in tight groups for mutual defense. Fighter escorts flew high and behind, ready to dive on RAF fighters that attacked the bombers. The Germans had numerical superiority and combat experience from Poland and France. But they also had weaknesses Gray learned to exploit. His first confirmed kill came in August 1940. a Messerschmitt Bf-110 heavy fighter destroyed over the channel. The 110 was fast in a straight line, but unmaneuverable compared to the Spitfire. Gray positioned himself behind one, close to optimal range, about 250 yards, close enough for accuracy but far enough to avoid debris from the exploding target, and fired a precise burst into the 100's engines and cockpit. The German aircraft caught fire and went down. Gray broke away, climbed back to altitude, and immediately engaged another target. No celebration, no reflection, just tactical movement to the next threat. The kills accumulated through August and September as the Battle of Britain reached its climax. Gray shot down Bf-19s, 100s, bombers, sometimes multiple aircraft in a single sortie. He developed a reputation for accuracy. When Gray fired, something usually died. His shooting was economical, rarely wasting ammunition on low-probability shots. He closed to effective range, aimed carefully despite the chaos, and fired short bursts that concentrated fire on vital areas. Other pilots sprayed bullets, hoping for hits. Gray placed his shots with marksman's precision. The barefoot flying gave him the rudder control he needed for these precise shots. Deflection shooting, hitting a maneuvering target, required coordinating all three control axes simultaneously. Ailerons banked the aircraft, elevators pointed the nose up or down, rudder swung the nose left or right. In a high-speed turning engagement, the pilot had to manipulate all three controls smoothly while pulling G-forces that made everything harder. Gray's bare feet felt every nuance of rudder position, let him make corrections measured in fractions of an inch, kept his gun sight tracking smoothly even during violent maneuvers. The advantage was small but real, and in combat, small advantages accumulated into survival. His tactical awareness was equally important. Gray learned to see the battle in 3 dimensions, to track multiple aircraft simultaneously, to predict where enemies would be rather than just reacting to where they were. He developed the fighter pilot's essential skill, the ability to process enormous amounts of information instantly and make correct decisions automatically. Check 6 for threats. Scan the sky for opportunities. Monitor fuel and ammunition. Maintain formation position. Listen to radio calls. Do all of this while flying at 300 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, with people actively trying to kill you. By the end of the Battle of Britain in October 1940, Gray was a section leader with 8 confirmed victories. He'd survived months of combat that killed many of his squadron mates. He'd learned lessons about aerial combat that couldn't be taught in training, lessons written in blood and wreckage. The tactician's evolution. Through 1941 and into 1942, Gray's score continued climbing as the air war over Europe intensified. The nature of combat changed. The Battle of Britain's desperate defense gave way to offensive sweeps over France, to escort missions protecting bombers, to intruder operations striking German airfields. Each type of mission required different tactics, different approaches, different applications of the fundamental skills Gray had mastered. He became known as a thinking fighter pilot, someone who studied enemy tactics and developed counters, who experimented with formations and attack methods, who shared knowledge with newer pilots joining the squadron. The RAF's tactical evolution through 1941 owed much to pilots like Gray, who'd survived long enough to learn what worked and had the analytical capability to articulate why. One of Gray's innovations was his emphasis on altitude advantage. He understood that altitude translated directly into energy, potential energy that could be converted to speed in a dive. The side that started higher could choose when and how to engage. Gray habitually positioned himself above expected enemy altitude, even if it meant climbing for extra minutes before an engagement. When combat began, he would dive from above, use the speed to make a firing pass, then zoom back to altitude before the enemy could respond. The tactic required discipline, fighting the urge to stay in a dogfight, accepting that one good shot and escape was better than prolonged combat, where luck mattered as much as skill. He also emphasized the value of surprise and aggression. Don't give the enemy time to react. Don't approach tentatively. Commit to the attack, close fast, shoot accurately, escape immediately. Gray's combat reports, preserved in RAF archives, are models of aggressive brevity. Intercepted enemy formation, destroyed one BF-109, broke away. No drama, no embellishment, just tactical facts, but the facts accumulated. Mission after mission, kill after kill, survival after survival. His barefoot flying became so well known that German intelligence apparently identified him by the characteristic. Some accounts, difficult to verify, suggest that Luftwaffe pilots were warned about the barefoot Spitfire pilot, who was particularly dangerous. Whether this is true or RAF mythology is unclear, but it reflects Gray's growing reputation. He wasn't just surviving, he was winning, consistently, against pilots who were themselves experienced and skilled. By mid-1942, Gray had been promoted to squadron leader and given command of 616 Squadron. Command brought new responsibilities, not just fighting but leading, training new pilots, managing operations, ensuring the squadron remained effective. Gray excelled at this too. He led from the front, flew the most dangerous missions himself, never asked subordinates to do anything he wouldn't do. His pilots trusted him because he kept them alive, while teaching them to kill effectively. The science of survival. What separated Gray from merely competent pilots wasn't supernatural ability. It was studied application of principles he'd identified through experience and analysis. He understood that aerial combat, despite its appearance of chaos, followed patterns. Aircraft had performance envelopes, speeds and altitudes where they operated best. Pilots had behavioral patterns, tendencies and habits that could be predicted. Tactics had strengths and weaknesses that could be exploited or avoided. Gray studied all of this methodically, turning combat flying from instinctive reaction into calculated violence. He emphasized gunnery above all else. The RAF's training program taught basic deflection shooting, but Gray believed most pilots never mastered it. Hitting a maneuvering target required understanding angular rates, lead angles, and ballistics. Not through mathematical calculation, but through practiced judgment, Gray drilled his pilots on gunnery constantly, insisting they understand exactly where their bullets went, relative to where their gun sight pointed. He taught them to fire in short bursts, to observe strikes and correct their aim, rather than holding the trigger and spraying bullets wildly. He also emphasized energy management, the concept that aircraft had only so much speed and altitude to work with, and every maneuver spent that energy. Tight turns bled speed. Climbs converted speed into altitude. Dives converted altitude into speed. The pilot who managed energy better, who knew when to turn and when to run, when to climb and when to dive, would win engagements against pilots with better aircraft but worse judgment. Gray could look at an engagement and instantly assess energy states. Who had advantage, who was vulnerable, when to attack and when to disengage. Perhaps most importantly, he taught survival. "The best pilot is the one who comes home," he reportedly told his squadron. Aggression was necessary, but suicidal aggression helped nobody know when to break off. Don't fixate on a single target when others are threatening you. Check 6 constantly. Never assume you're safe. These lessons, learned through watching friends die from mistakes, kept Gray alive through years when most pilots died within weeks of arriving at operational squadrons. The barefoot flying fit into this calculated approach. It wasn't eccentricity. It was optimization. Gray had identified a small advantage in rudder control and exploited it despite the cold, despite the risk of injury, despite looking peculiar. This willingness to ignore convention in pursuit of effectiveness characterized his entire approach to combat flying. He didn't care about looking proper. He cared about killing the enemy and surviving to do it again. The final score. By late 1943, Gray's confirmed score exceeded 28 aerial victories, making him one of the highest-scoring Allied aces. The exact number remains disputed. Wartime kill confirmation was imperfect, and Gray himself was modest about claims, preferring conservative estimates over inflated scores. But by any measure, he was exceptionally effective over a sustained period, surviving combat that killed most of his contemporaries. He was eventually wrested from combat operations. The RAF had learned that burning out experienced pilots through continuous combat was wasteful. Gray served in training and staff roles, passing his knowledge to new pilots, helping develop tactics and procedures that incorporated lessons from years of combat. His influence extended beyond his personal kill score to the dozens of pilots he trained and commanded, who survived because of what he taught them. After the war, Gray returned to New Zealand, living quietly and rarely discussing his wartime service. Like many combat veterans, he found that the experiences that seemed normal during the war, killing people, watching friends die, flying barefoot into combat, were difficult to explain to people who hadn't experienced them. The barefoot flying that made him famous seemed trivial compared to the larger realities of what he'd done and seen. He died in 1995 at age 81, having lived a long life that was in itself remarkable for someone who'd survived years of fighter combat. His obituaries emphasized his ace status, and the barefoot legend some mentioned his tactical innovations and leadership. Few captured the essential reality that Gray had been one of a small number of pilots whose skill and aggression during critical periods had genuinely influenced outcomes, who'd helped defeat the Luftwaffe through accumulated small victories that added up to strategic effect. The reality behind the legend. The barefoot pilot story is compelling because it's unusual. It gives Gray a hook, a memorable characteristic that distinguishes him from other aces, but focusing on the bare feet risks missing what actually made him effective. The feet were a detail, a small optimization in pursuit of better rudder control. What mattered was the mind behind the feat, the tactical intelligence, the studied aggression, the ability to learn from experience and apply those lessons systematically. Gray succeeded because he approached combat flying as both art and science. The art was in the flying itself, the feel for the aircraft, the ability to maneuver instinctively, the marksman's touch on the trigger. The science was in the tactical analysis, understanding energy states, predicting enemy behavior, exploiting patterns, managing risk. He combined these elements more effectively than most pilots could, and he did it consistently over years, when consistency meant the difference between becoming an ace and becoming a casualty statistic. The barefoot flying symbolizes this approach. The willingness to question conventions, to experiment with improvements, to optimize every advantage, no matter how small, in an environment where margins between success and failure were measured in fractions of seconds, where the difference between a kill and being killed could be a few feet of position or a fraction of a degree of deflection. Gray understood that every advantage mattered. Most pilots flew in boots because that's what they were issued. Gray flew barefoot because he'd tested both methods and determined that barefoot gave him better control. This empirical approach to solving problems characterized everything he did. The lessons that endure. Colin Gray's story offers lessons that extend beyond World War II aviation. The most obvious is that small optimizations, consistently applied, produce measurable advantages. The bare feet gave him perhaps a few percent improvement in rudder control, enough to matter in high-stakes situations, not enough to explain his success, but Gray sought similar small advantages everywhere. In his gunnery technique, his tactical positioning, his energy management, his situational awareness, these advantages accumulated into effectiveness that appeared to observers like natural talent, but was actually studied refinement. The second lesson is about the value of empirical testing over adherence to convention. Flying boots were standard equipment designed by people who understood cold and injury risk, but Gray tested the alternative and found that for him, the control advantage outweighed the risks. Many pilots would have accepted the conventional wisdom without testing. Gray questioned it, experimented, and adopted what worked better for his circumstances. This scientific approach, hypothesis, test, adopt what works, produced better results than blindly following doctrine. The third lesson concerns the relationship between survival and effectiveness. Gray survived not through caution, but through calculated aggression. He attacked aggressively, but from positions of advantage. He maneuvered violently, but maintained energy awareness. He closed to deadly range, but ensured he had an escape route. This balance between aggression and survival let him accumulate victories while living to fight again. Reckless pilots died quickly. Cautious pilots were ineffective. Gray found the balance that maximized both lethality and survival, the optimal point where aggression and prudence intersected. Finally, Gray's story illustrates the importance of sharing knowledge. He didn't hoard his tactical insights. He taught them to other pilots, incorporated them into squadron doctrine, wrote them into combat reports that circulated through fighter command. His influence extended far beyond his personal kill score to the effectiveness of pilots he trained and inspired. In this sense, his legacy is multiplicative, not just the 28-plus aircraft he personally destroyed, but the additional victories achieved by pilots who learned from him and survived because he taught them how. The measure of a fighter pilot. The RAF produced many aces during World War II, pilots who achieved 5 or more confirmed kills and earned recognition as exceptional. Among these aces, Gray stands out not because his score was highest, it wasn't, but because his career demonstrated sustained effectiveness over extended periods, because he survived when most didn't, and because he combined tactical brilliance with the willingness to optimize every detail in pursuit of better performance. The bare feet, the detail that made him famous, were just one small piece of this larger picture. They symbolize Gray's approach to combat flying, empirical, unconventional, focused on practical effectiveness rather than appearance. In a military culture that emphasized conformity and protocol, Gray's willingness to fly barefoot because it made him more effective demonstrated the independence of thought that characterized his entire career. Modern fighter pilots study World War II aces for lessons applicable to contemporary combat. Gray's emphasis on gunnery remains relevant even in an age of missiles. The fundamental skill of putting weapons on target. His focus on energy management translates directly to modern BFM, basic fighter maneuvers training. His tactical patience, waiting for advantageous situations rather than accepting unfavorable fights, reflects principles that remain valid, and his empirical approach to solving problems, test, measure, adopt what works, is the foundation of effective training programs worldwide. The Barefoot pilot was ultimately just a pilot who happened to fly barefoot. But he was also a tactician who outthought his opponents, a marksman who shot with precision, a leader who taught others to survive, and a warrior who accumulated victories through studied application of principles he'd identified and refined. The bare feet made him memorable. The mind made him deadly. And the combination made him one of World War II's most effective fighter pilots. A man who proved that sometimes the smallest optimizations, consistently applied with tactical brilliance, produce extraordinary results. Colin Gray flew into combat without boots because it gave him better rudder control. He flew into legend because he understood that small advantages, accumulated across hundreds of combat missions, were the difference between becoming an ace and becoming a memory, and he survived to teach others those lessons, multiplying his effectiveness far beyond what any individual pilot could achieve alone. That's the real story, not the bare feet, but the mind and skill and studied aggression they enabled. Thank you for watching and listening. We really appreciate it. Please consider subscribing, liking, and even sharing this video.